Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to this meeting of Talking About Socialism from a Marxist Point of View. My name is Nick Rack. I'm one of the organisers of Talking About Socialism. We have these meetings every fortnight on Zoom, and we're very pleased today to have Moshe Machova, who's going to be speaking on what is a communist solution to the colonial conflict in the Middle East. Moshe has been writing and talking about this subject and presenting his arguments and ideas since at least the middle of the 1960s. Always a welcome guest. This evening, unusually, we're going to give Moshe 40 minutes to introduce the discussion. We normally give our speakers 20, but because this is such an important issue, and Moshe is such a well-versed and interesting person to listen to, we've given him more. We're sure there's going to be lots of questions. Our normal format is that once we open it up to the discussion, we try to encourage everybody to speak, and we therefore normally limit people to 3 minutes. But if you've got something controversial or you disagree with what Moshe or anybody else has said, we'll probably give you a little bit longer. The most important thing is that we have a discussion and we air our views. So please don't hold back. This meeting is going to be recorded and it will be up on YouTube. And if people are watching this on YouTube now after the event, can I ask you please to press the subscribe button so that you can get information about Talking About Socialism, notification about our videos, and so on. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to invite Moshe to address the meeting for 40 minutes, Moshe. We'll then open it up. We might need to take a break for refreshment or whatever, but we'll just see how it goes. So Moshe, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to talk to you. This is my second Zoom meeting with this forum. The last one was, I think, in October last year, very soon after the beginning of the present genocidal war. As you heard in the brief exchange between Nick and me a few minutes ago, what I'm going to say is not something new, at least not to people who have read and listened to what I've been saying for the last several decades. I think it's in near 6 decades, certainly more than 5. Since the position that I'm going to put forward basically is documented since the mid-1960s and it can be found in the archive of Matzpen, which is online, which is still being kept, although the organization Matzpen no longer exists. So I'm going to speak about what would be a communist Marxist program for resolution of the colonial conflict in Israel-Palestine. I take it as needing no explanation that this is really a colonial conflict. It is a conflict due to colonization. Now, this is not a value judgment. This is a matter of fact. And although you hear Zionist ideologues and propagandists denying that the conflict in Israel-Palestine is a colonial one, this is based on ignorance and assuming the ignorance of the people who are subjected to this false argument. Because if you look at the literature of the Zionist movement itself, in its early days, at least until the middle of the 20th century, it refers to itself as a project of colonization. The Zionist project is described unproblematically by the Zionists themselves as a project of colonizing Palestine by Jews in order to form a majority Jewish nation state in Palestine. So I take this as read, but while this can be assumed, it is not an unproblematic one because, as I will explain, it doesn't actually, it's not sufficient in order to understand the real parameters of the problem. So let me start by putting forward an abstract description of what kind of thing we would take as a resolution of the conflict. What would it look like? This is simply a list of minimum conditions that it has to satisfy in order to count as a benign resolution of the conflict, benign rather than the defeat of the colonized and the ultimate victory of the colonizers. So I think there are just a few minimum conditions. First of all, equal rights to all individuals in living in this territory, in this space of Israel-Palestine. Next, equal national rights. There are, in fact, this is I think should be self-understood and obvious, but the reality is often fudged by propaganda. In fact, there are basically two national groups present in the Israeli-Palestinian space. There is the Palestinian national entity, which is part of a broader, larger pan-Arab national entity. The existence of this larger national entity embracing several particular national groups is something that is basic in the space of the Middle East. And I would add to it the right of return of the Palestinian refugees of 1948. Now, I think equal individual rights needs no arguing. It is self-evident that no situation which fails to grant equal rights to all is not a benign solution. It cannot be regarded from a socialist point of view as a solution. Equal national rights, simply because if one nation has less rights than the other, if one nation is dominated, or if there exists a superiority of one national group over the other, then this is not going to be a stable situation in which the subjected nationality will accept its fate and will accept its position as subordinate. And the right of return is simply a basic right recognized by international law and by the elements of elementary justice. But this is very abstract. It just tells us what kind of thing would count as a benign resolution of the conflict. It doesn't tell us, and it doesn't include any condition about the geometry. Will it be one state, two state, a confederation, and so on? I don't think this is part of minimum conditions resolution has to satisfy, because we, at this stage, we cannot dictate, or we cannot prescribe what is the exact geometry of this resolution. It can take many forms, so I would leave this open. Well, this is an abstract list of conditions which need to be satisfied. It doesn't tell us anything about the possibility of achieving them, or the conditions in which they will be achievable. I'll come to that later. And this is the core of what I'm going to talk about. But let me just, in order to illustrate what I mean, let me examine the actual so-called solutions that are proposed in the world discourse about the conflict, the colonial conflict in Israel-Palestine. There are ideas about two-state solution, and I'm talking here not about the abstract notion of two-state solution. I'm talking about the two-state solution as it is advocated by the United States, by its camp followers, so-called the international community, which is just another name for the United States and its camp followers. It has been rejected by Israel explicitly, but it is still advocated. It's advocated by the British government. It's advocated by Jeremy Corbyn, the two-state solution, not as an abstract geometry of the existing of two states, but with particular conditions. And if you look at the details of this proposal, it doesn't satisfy the minimum condition for a benign solution, because you don't have the basic condition of equality of national rights. As actually advocated by the so-called international community, it envisages a dominant Israel with a subservient Palestinian quarter of a state, which is not completely sovereign. It is demilitarized. It is completely subject to Israeli dictate and supremacy. So this doesn't satisfy even the minimum condition. I'm not talking about a two-state solution in the abstract. I'm talking about the way it is actually presented and supported, at least nominally, by international actors. Going over to a one-state solution, there are various versions of it, as well as various versions now more recently advocated of a confederal or a federal solution. Some versions of it, as put forward, do satisfy the minimum. Not all of them, but some versions. Some versions don't actually relate to the question of equality of national rights, but some do. And as a matter of fact, they do satisfy the minimum condition. What is problematic about these two concrete, actual ideas for resolving the conflict is the question of feasibility and agency. Is it possible to implement them? Under what conditions is it possible? Is it possible to implement them? And who is going to be the agent for implementing them? Marxists usually pose this question. I mean, people have advocated socialism long before Marx came along. What was novel, or one of the things that was novel in the Marxist concept of socialism, was that it delineated two things. First of all, an agent. Which social agent is going to lead to this desired outcome? And secondly, more or less the process through which this socialist transformation of society would come about. Similarly, if you want to take a Marxist point of view towards the conflict we are talking about, you have to raise these two problems. And here is the crux of the matter. This is the difficult part. It is not difficult to describe a kind of situation in which the problem, the conflict would have been resolved, as people who put forward the one state or confederal solution. You can find in the literature even some details of a proposed constitution. What is not discussed, and from a Marxist point of view, this is the weakness of these positions, is the question of process and agency, how it is going to come about and who is going to do it. Okay. Now, I said that it is pretty clear, and I need very little argumentation to see that the conflict we are talking about is a colonial conflict. It is a conflict brought about by colonization, specifically by the project of Zionist colonization, which started more or less at the beginning of the 20th century, and it is still ongoing. I mean, the process of Zionist colonization of the space of Israel-Palestine is ongoing as we speak. You only have to open your newspaper or look at the news to realize that this is what is going on. So, presumably, if you look at the literature on colonial questions and colonial conflicts in the Marxist literature, in the tradition, let us say, of the Second International, the Comintern, and later, you may find some clues as to an approach that would be useful to addressing the problem that we are talking about. Unfortunately, this is not the case. And this is because the colonization of Palestine follows a pattern, follows a model which is not fundamentally discussed in the tradition of the socialist movement, starting from the early 20th century, or even the late 19th century. Why is this? It's because the model of colonization followed by the Zionist project is not at all the same, not similar to those that were discussed in the tradition of Marxist politics since the beginning of the 20th century. It is very common to refer to the kind of colonization that is taking place in Israel-Palestine as settler colonialism. as opposed to other forms of colonialism. In my opinion, this description is misleading, not because it is incorrect. Certainly, it is correct to classify the Zionist colonization of Palestine as settler colonialism. But this classification, which originates in, as far as I can tell, in post-colonial academic discourse, is too wide, and it doesn't address the conflict in the way that Marxists should address it and have addressed colonial conflicts, and that is through its basic political economy. Settler colonialism puts into one bag the colonization of, let's take two prominent examples, South Africa and Australia, or North America and Algeria. Okay, they are all settler colonialism. But if you look at it from a Marxist point of view, you have to look at the political economy. The first question to ask is, who are the direct producers? And here there is a vast conflict, vast difference between the South African model, for example, or the Algerian model on the one hand, and the Australian or North American model on the other hand. And the crucial difference is that in Algeria, South Africa, the main direct producers were the indigenous people, not the colonizers. The indigenous people were for the colonizers a valuable resource in the same way that the proletariat is a resource for the capitalist class. The capitalist class is antagonistic to the proletariat, but it needs the proletariat. This is elementary Marxism. I'm not innovating anything here. But look at it in the colonial conflict, in the colonial context. In the case of South Africa, the indigenous people were the source of profit, the source of production, the direct producers of the political economic system. They were dispossessed of the land and so on, but they were needed as labor power. This was not the case in Australia. This was not the case in North America. Now, the thing is that when we come to the 20th century, when the modern socialist movement started to address the colonial question, the other type of colonization, the Australian type, let me call it an exclusion colonialism. Exclusion because the indigenous people were not to be exploited, but excluded. They were surplus to requirement. In Australia, in North America, etc. In New Zealand, they were surplus to requirement. But by the time the socialist movement came to address the colonial question, all these cases of colonization, the exclusion type of colonization, were already in the history book. They were finished. They were all, by the way, they were all finished in the victory of the colonizers. When the socialist movement started to address the colonial question, and if you look at the debates in the Second International, in the Comintern and beyond, they are all concerned with the other type of colonization, with exploitative colonization. So whether the position of the socialist movement, the traditional position of the socialist movement towards the colonial question was correct or incorrect is really irrelevant, because it doesn't give us any help. They all address a different type of colonization, which is not the model followed by the Zionist project. In fact, the Zionist project is an anachronism. When Kautsky was writing, for example, in 1907 about colonialism, he was addressing what he called work colonization, what I have termed extrusion colonization, as something that is in the history book. It's no longer a live issue. So whether his attitude, his political position towards colonialism was right or wrong is really irrelevant. It's of no help. And here, if you take the Marxist view, I think you come to conclusions that are that one would be difficult to regard as optimistic. You see, since the middle of the 20th century, there have been decolonizations left, right, and center. Virtually all the colonial situations that existed there, except one, have been resolved by decolonization of one sort or another. Good, the last case of this kind was in South Africa. South Africa was decolonized. Some people hoped and some people promised that the colonization of South Africa would be associated with the socialist transformation. It didn't happen. There was no departure from capitalism in South Africa, but it was decolonized. What remains is the colonial conflict, colonial situation in Israel-Palestine, which follows this much older and in other instances already resolved in favor of the colonizers. This has remained open. What has allowed the decolonization of those other colonies since the middle of the 20th century, as opposed to the failure of decolonization in Australia, for example? Why was it possible in South Africa and did not happen in Australia? Well, if you look at the actual details of the situation, it is very clear. First of all, in the exploitative type of colonization, the colonizers quite naturally were a relatively small minority. In some places, a very small minority. The demographic balance was against them. The other thing was that they depended on the indigenous people. Whatever iniquities were perpetrated by the settlers in South Africa, one thing they couldn't do, they couldn't exterminate, they couldn't ethnically cleanse the indigenous people of the colony. And the same applies to Algeria. The second to last instance of colonialism which has been decolonized. They couldn't, and it didn't actually arise, the option of ethnically cleansing the indigenous people in South Africa or in Algeria didn't arise because they were needed. I mean, just as the bourgeoisie can suppress, oppress, exploit the proletariat, but it is not going to exterminate it, because who is going to do the work? It is very different in the model of colonization followed by the Zionist project and by the Israeli state. First of all, the numerical balance was very different. It has taken time, of course, and in the case of the Zionist project, it is still not complete, but certainly you cannot say that the colonizers are a very small minority. In Australia and in North America, they became eventually an overwhelming majority. Secondly, and most importantly, they had always the option of implementing their colonization through the ethnic cleansing and eventual extermination. In the case of Tasmania, for example, it was total physical extermination of the indigenous people. In the rest of Australia, approaching this total extermination, not quite. In North America, well, we know the situation. So if you look at these precedents, the message is not very optimistic. I think it would be wrong to indulge in false optimism in a situation which doesn't really justify. If we go purely by historical precedents, then of course the situation is lost. But of course, there is no certainty in this. I mean, fatalism is not justified. We can ask, although with maybe not a great deal of optimism, but we can still ask: are there any possible conditions under which the colonial conflict in Israel-Palestine can be resolved in a benign way, fulfilling the minimum conditions that I've delineated earlier? I think there is such a possibility. Now, look at what an implementation of a benign solution would require. If you look at any kind of resolution, possible resolution of the conflict, it will require the overthrow of the Zionist regime. Since this is a colonial situation, it can only be resolved in a benign way by decolonization. Decolonization would mean, in the concrete conditions of Israel-Palestine, decolonization of Palestine. Decolonization of Palestine would mean overthrow of the Zionist regime. If you look at the proposed one-state solution, federal solution that are mandate in the media by non-Marxists, you will not find this made clear that in fact this solution, this one-state solution, for example, those which are benign in character, can only be achieved by overthrow of the Zionist regime. Because this raises the question, who is going to do it? How the Zionist regime can be overthrown? I've asked you to read 2 or 3 articles that I have written where I developed the argument that this cannot be done if the overthrow of the Zionist regime is under conditions that lead to a capitalist outcome. The reason is that as far as I can see, and as far as has been evident, I think since the beginning of this conflict, external forces are not capable of overthrowing the Zionist regime of Israel. This has been tried in various ways. This has failed in several ways, and it has led in each case to actual extension of Zionist colonization and changing of the balance of forces in its favor. The Palestinian people by themselves cannot achieve this either. This has been tried, and again, it has not succeeded for the simple reason that unlike the situation, for example, in Algeria or in South Africa, the Palestinian people don't have the leverage that the indigenous people in South Africa did have as being the direct producers, as being indispensable for the regime. They put the South African regime in a situation where it became very costly and inefficient to try to repress the indigenous people, of which they couldn't get rid of, and it was not in their interest. So they had to compromise. This situation does not obtain in Palestine. I mean, the Palestinian people don't have the economic leverage that the indigenous people of South Africa have. Who is capable of overthrowing the Israeli regime? Obviously, the Israeli people themselves. Predominantly, the majority of the people, the Israeli Jewish working class. It is certainly capable of overthrowing the Zionist regime, potentially. It has the leverage, but will it have an interest in doing it? What would it gain? What would the Israeli working class gain by overthrowing the present Zionist regime if the outcome would be a capitalist one state or a capitalist decolonized state? The Israeli working class would exchange its present position of being an exploited class under but in a position of national privilege to a position of still exploited working class, if we are talking about a capitalist resolution, but without national privileges. This is not a deal that can attract the majority of the Israeli working class. Maybe a small minority, yes, on let us say, based on very far-sighted vision. But you cannot expect the Israeli working class to agree to exchange its position, its present position of being part of a dominant, privileged national group, which it obviously is, for a position without this privilege, but without anything in exchange. And here we come to the logic of what drove Matzpen from basically from its early days. A socialist resolution can offer such an, at least theoretically, logically, the possibility exists. This would mean that the Israeli working class would exchange its present position of an exploited class with national privileges to a position of a part of a dominant class without national privileges. This kind of obtaining class advantages in exchange for giving up national privileges, this is at least in principle a deal that makes some sense and is possible, and this leads to the position that I'm advocating, that is to say that the resolution from a socialist point of view, the resolution of the colonial conflict in Israel-Palestine is not something that can be achieved independently of a socialist transformation. It can only be achieved as part of a socialist transformation, and this obviously means, I don't have to argue it, it's not a socialist transformation in one country, certainly not as small as Israel-Palestine, but at the very least a regional socialist transformation. So this leads to the conclusion that from a socialist Marxist point of view, the decolonization of Palestine, benign resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli colonial conflict can only come about as part of a socialist transformation of the Arab East, at the very least. Whether it will take the form of a one-state geometry, two-state geometry, confederal, this is not something that I think is profitable to discuss at this stage. We are not talking about something, you know, that is going to happen anytime soon. Whether it will happen at all is an open question. It may. This conflict may end in the way that it ended in Australia or in North America. This is still a possibility, and certainly the Zionist regime will do its utmost to achieve this kind of malign resolution of the conflict. It is doing so as we speak. What is happening in Gaza, what is happening elsewhere in the Middle East is part of this drive to achieve victory of the colonizers. Whether they will be able to do so is still an open question. Thank you.
Moshe, thank you very much in that brilliant exposition of a Marxist point of view. I thought it was very thorough, inclusive, covered loads of ground. Unfortunately, it's a view that doesn't have majority purchase in the working class internationally in the struggle to protect Gaza and the Palestinian masses. So I'm going to open it up for a discussion. And I just wanted to welcome, first of all the people that are attending their first meeting of talking about socialism from a Marxist point of view. We hope to encourage critical engagement. So if anybody's got any points of disagreement, anybody's got any questions, please don't hesitate to raise them. So what I'm going to do now is ask you, if you want to speak, either use the yellow hand, raised hand, or wave your hand, and either me or somebody else will see it, and I'll call you in. We'll try to limit people to 3 minutes to begin with, just so that we get everybody in. I'm sure that everybody's got something to say, so please don't hesitate. And I can see Tony Wright, a new welcome to a new visitor to our discussion. So Tony, I'm going to call you in.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you to Moshe. That was excellent. I believe that all colonialism is a blight on humanity. Really, it's gone on for so long, and it's never come out right in the end. What concerns me is that I would like to know if Moshe knows what was hoped to be achieved by the 7th of October attack last year, because I can't see it achieving anything. Quite the contrary, we've got over 40,000 deaths now, mainly of women and children, and it's not leaving an end to it. Gaza is destroyed. And was it to force a solution by way of one state or two state? I can't see a one state solution working, because the hatred between the two factions is incredible, and also the oppression of the Palestinians will not stop. So I think the two-state solution is the answer, if it can be policed or sanctioned in some way. With regards to so I've got a cold, I can hardly speak. With regards to Hamas, as I say, I don't see what they were trying to achieve, but also I understand the Palestinians voting them into Gaza back in 2006 because they're clutching at straws for somebody to try and A, defend them, and B, be a voice for them. But I'm not sure if it's the right voice. And with regards to overthrowing the state of Israel, I can't see that happening with the backing of the West. Both us and America are ardent backers of whatever they do, whatever international law they break. Us and America seem to defend them. So there's a lot of points there, but these were just sort of things I was thinking about when Moshe was speaking. Thanks, Nick. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tony. Really, really good questions that I think a lot of people will have and share your questions there. I'm going to call in Ed, and please again don't hesitate to others to put your hand up. Ed.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks to Moshe for the introduction. I had a question which might be quite involved in answering it, but Moshe set out the choice, if I can put it that way, facing the Israeli working class, and said, I think that the Israeli working class just aren't going to sign up enthusiastically to a deal which involves them still remaining an oppressed class as a working class, but losing the national privileges that they currently have. And I'd be really interested, Moshe, if you could potentially address the Palestinian working class in similar terms or in a similar framework, because it seems to me that it could be said that they have also two options, broadly speaking, on the table. And the first is to try and overturn the current state of affairs as regards national privileges and obtain a privileged position for themselves as a nation. And the second is to seek emancipation on a class basis. The first, it seems to me, is hard to see or hard to envisage happening without an extraordinary amount of human suffering, which makes it unpalatable to us, I would say, as a proposal. But the second option, emancipation on a class basis, clearly has a number of obstacles in its way, not least that it would involve making common cause across the lines of the current conflict. So I was wondering if you could just address that, potentially, the attitudes of the Palestinian working class, and why and under what circumstances they might be won to choosing the latter, so emancipation of themselves as a class, rather than seeking to liberate themselves as a nation.
Thanks, Ed. Again, great questions. Virginia McFadden.
Hi, I'm sorry I had to miss the first half hour of this talk, so forgive me if I'm treading on ground that has already been, described or discussed. But I was wondering, Moshe, how do you view the population of Israel is pretty much the same, more or less, as the Palestinian population. But I gather that the Palestinian population, apart from being slaughtered and exterminated, as they're happening now massively in front of our eyes, it has been on the whole growing, whereas the Israeli population has been on the decline, and Israelis have left Israel in a certain number. And so how do you, and apart from, as said, the US, clearly by their actions requiring Israel as an attack dog, and also the contradictions that that exist in terms of South Africa, which certainly brought that genocide or war crimes accusation against Israel. But still they trade with Israel. China trades surveillance equipment with Israel. There are all these contradictions that are going on. And so, but I guess the main point is the one I just initially made about the ferocity has to do with, to some extent, also neoliberalism has affected the Israeli working class, the Israeli population, and all these very specific things to do with recent years. So I'm just sort of combining a comment with a question, I guess. But yeah. Anyway, that's enough gibberish for now.
No, thanks very much, Virginia. Again, really, really good points. I'm going to call in Kate and then Will, and then I'm going to ask Moshe to come back because otherwise you'll have too much to deal with. So, Kate.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Can you hear me all right? Yes. I found that yellow hand. I couldn't find it for ages. I found it. Yeah, my question is kind of, I think it's quite simplistic, really. But what I wanted to know from Moshe is, do the Israelis see themselves as an exploited class? I mean, I can see the issue of the hostages, like they're being used as pawns. I can see there's been protests about democracy. There's military conscription. I don't really know enough. So to want to give up the privileges they have, I feel they would have to really recognize and feel oppressed by the exploitation. And how does the balance play out? It's like when you're prepared to fight in unity with other people, and you've been in a better position, you have to realize that you have to give up certain privileges. So that's what I wanted to ask about, really.
Thanks very much, Kate. Will.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions, really. One is about what's going on inside the kind of government in Israel. Because I mean, I don't have knowledge of this, and it seems to be very tense, very fractious, given that there's the defense minister was sacked, and there's all kinds of struggles going on. So how's Netanyahu holding it together, and what does his future hold, I guess? And the second thing is I was wondering about changing kind of global political circumstances. I'm wondering whether even if the Zionists manage to perhaps colonize part of the Gaza and kind of throw out the Palestinians from Gaza, even to get their way, there's still going to be 5-6 million Palestinians in the area, yeah? And if there is a change in the global situation and the power relations between different countries, does that not pose an opening? And that leads me to something I don't know about, which is what's the attitude of China and Russia towards what we're seeing? Are they just silent because they're compliant, or what's going on there? I don't know.
Thanks very much, Will. I'm going to invite Moshe to come back. But before Moshe does respond to those questions, I'm going to draw the attention of people, if they haven't seen them. We've got two points which Moshe might want to answer either now or later. Peter Bloomer has said in the chat, the struggle against apartheid Israel inevitably involves an armed resistance over the course of struggle against the Zionist colonization of Palestine. The occupation of Gaza and the economic blockade since 2007 subjugates many Palestinians to degradation. The breakout from Gaza last October was undertaken without the expectation of its outcome. And then Ghassan Abdullah says, Moshe, always principled and committed, chapeau. The right to self-determination, one aspect of which is a sovereign Palestinian state, is still the declared aim. It will be possible if colonies / settlements are disbanded or subject to Palestinian law. Later, a confederal arrangement could be considered. So thanks very much for Peter and Ghassan. Ghassan's new to our discussion, so welcome. I'm going to invite Moshe to come back on those points, and then we've got two more comrades with their hands up. That's Pamela and Janet. So please, again, don't waste the time or miss the opportunity, rather, of asking your question when we come back. So, Moshe, do you want to come back in on those points?
Oh, well, how long have you got?
Well,
yes, I mean, there's I've made a list of this. There's quite a lot of this. I start in the same order as they've been asked.
Well, Moshe, can I just before you start, if you take 10 minutes now, and then I'll invite other people, get Pamela and Janet to do, say, 5 or 10 minutes more, and then bring you back for a final 10 minutes. How's that?
Okay, I try.
Yeah.
But what did Hamas intend to achieve by the attack on the 7th of October? I'm not the one to explicate this. There have been various theories. I think they acted out of desperation. That's my personal view, to simply stir the pot to get a situation which has been congealing in the way which is horrific for the Palestinian people, to maybe start some kind of regional explosion that I don't know would I mean, look, you can't factor out of the situation the fact that Hamas is ideologically regressive organization with regressive ideology. And certainly, if you have listened to what I said before, it is not capable of actually leading to a resolution of the colonial conflict, because what the way that it acted and its ideology and practice is not going to win over the forces of the Israeli society that are able to overthrow the Zionist regime. The forces that Hamas itself can mobilize are certainly not adequate to do this. In fact, armed resistance, I mean, the question of armed resistance is a complicated one. Certainly, there is no question that in terms of international law and morality, the Palestinian people have every right to engage in armed resistance. The question is not the question of right. Of course, it has to be done in a way that obeys the basic principles of just war. The question is not whether they have the right. The question is it a useful way for the Palestinians to achieve liberation? And I think experience has shown amply that every attempt of the Palestinian liberation to engage in armed struggle has actually been used by the Zionist regime to advance its own aims of ethnic cleansing. This is what the present war in Gaza is about. No matter what led Hamas to do the attack on the 7th of October last year, the Israeli Zionist regime led by Netanyahu has made use of it in order to advance its long-term aims of ethnic cleansing. The Palestinian working class, again, I mean, each of these questions would require a whole discussion in its own right. I would just want to point out that the Palestinian working class in Israel-Palestine is divided basically into two parts. One of it is the Palestinian working class consisting of Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. There is inside Israel 20%, roughly 20% of the population are Palestinian Arabs, and they form part of the Israeli working class, not sufficiently numerous by itself to lead to the overthrow of the Zionist regime, but they can certainly play a supplementary role. The Palestinian working class in the occupied territories in the West Bank and until recently in the Gaza Strip were partly allowed to work inside Israel. Israel made it sure that it didn't depend too much on their labor power. It granted it as more or less as a favor to Palestinian workers from the West Bank and formerly until this war from the Gaza Strip to work in Israel under very restricted and controlled position. The situation was that the Palestinian working class in these occupied territories depended more on Israel than vice versa. Israel minimally dependent on these working forces, but they were not in a strategic position to overthrow the Zionist regime. Jeannie, the demographic balance, if left on its own, it will work eventually, gradually, in favor of the Palestinian population. The Palestinian population is increasing at a higher rate than the Israeli Jewish population. However, I mean, the Zionist leaders are well aware of it, and their answer to this, as to the basic problems of the Zionist regime, is ethnic cleansing. I mean, they are determined to counteract the change in the demographic balance in favor of the Palestinian population by ethnically cleansing as much of it as possible. And this is not going to stop in Gaza. On the card is, in fact, before the attack on the 7th of October last year, I had predicted a situation of ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. I think this is still on the card. I was taken, as many people, many other people were, most people were, by the attack last year, which Israel opportunistically turned to its advantage by doing the present genocidal ethnic cleansing in Gaza. But the long-term plans still remain vis-a-vis the West Bank. So this is not going to end in Gaza as far as the Zionist leaders are concerned. The Israeli government, I mean, again, it would take long to discuss the tensions within the Israeli government. The basic facts are that Netanyahu is more or less a prisoner in of the more explicitly extremist factions in his government. Without them, he cannot remain in power. That means that he's beholden to people like Bezalel Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who are explicit ethnic cleansers and who are essential to his survival politically in the present situation. So this is more or less the
Moshe? Moshe, just let me interrupt you there, if I may. And
I think I've said all I wanted to say.
Okay, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite Pamela, Janet, and John to come in, and then I'm going to give you the final 10 or so minutes to come back and develop any points that you want. So can I see Pamela? Thanks.
Thank you, Nick, and hello, Moshe. Yeah, I mean, I've got a lot to say. So my first point is that Israel, as you were just saying, used the Hamas breakout to continue its plans of genocide and the clearance of the Palestinians. But that's because it is an American, it's a proxy war on behalf of America to control the Middle East. And Netanyahu has said their bigger plan is to reset the Middle East. In other words, Israeli political control over Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and eventually Iran and Egypt. And that, as I understand it, the Israeli government, that is the Israeli government's aim, as well as getting rid of the Palestinians, is to reset the Middle East, which is what the United States wants. And you have the complicity of all the Arab states around it, apart from the Houthis. So it isn't a local conflict. It is on behalf of the United States government. So in terms of practical action, I found myself all year campaigning on BDS in order to isolate Israel and make it a pariah state, as the Palestinians have said, based on the fight against South Africa apartheid. But of course, as you say, it's a much worse position for the Palestinians because they don't have the leverage that the South African workers had. So on the one hand, I'm involved in the intensification of BDS. And also our job here in practical terms is to weaken the Starmer government as much as possible. It's just the Tories Mark II, isn't it? Yeah. So first of all, the world situation, and secondly, what should we be doing? Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela. Janet.
Yeah, thanks, Nick and Moshe. It's just a question, and it may not be that relevant. I'm not sure. But I'd like to know what Moshe thinks about it. It seems to me that there is a kind of growing traction on the left, and I think it's led by David Miller, actually, that puts this whole thing in a different context, a different political and historical context than what I think Moshe does. And I certainly agree totally with Moshe's, but maybe I'm misunderstanding what David Miller is saying, but I don't think so. He seems to have, and I'm saying this because I think there is some traction, as I said, from elements of the left, or I wouldn't bother with it really, but he seems to be saying that the predominance in all of this is actually Zionism. And he also now always talks about Jewish supremacy. And he seems to be, and other people seem to be, really distorting the political and historical context that you describe in terms of this particular form of settler colonialism. And he is saying, and other people are saying, that our efforts have to be in eradicating Zionism, but actually focusing on, for example, Zionist institutions and organizations, say, within the UK, if we're in the UK. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be fighting those and challenging them and exposing what their agenda is. But when that becomes a predominant strategy, I think, A, it's kind of dangerous, and B, it's a distortion. And I'm not sure if I think some of that, because I'm Jewish and anti-Zionist Jew, I always have been, it seems to me, and that's why I say I think it's not just wrong, but dangerous. And actually is bordering on anti-Semitism. And I very rarely say anything is anti-Semitic, except when people are, hating Jews for being Jews. But I think the way that this is being put forward tips it over to some extent, but and maybe that's not the most important thing about it, but maybe I've misunderstood it. And maybe what they are saying is actually compatible with what you were saying, Moshe. But I don't think so. But I'd like to know if you've got any views on that at all, or you think I've got it wrong, or you think actually it's irrelevant.
Thanks very much, Janet. Interesting points. I'm going to call in John, but John, are you still there? Okay, John, you had your hand up? Are you still there?
I did have my hand up, but I've decided not to speak because I think that everything's been really covered. Really.
Okay, all right.
Most of the questions I would have liked partly answered.
Okay, well, thanks very much, John. I'm just going to read two comments that have appeared, which Moshe might not have seen. Will has posted a comment which I think is a contribution to what went before. Might it, and he's talking about October the 7th, rather, might it have been the case that Hamas was losing lots of support in Gaza and the 7th of October attack was its last roll of the dice? And Peter Bloomer has said, Hamas support was based on its support of the need to overthrow the Israeli state as the PLO gave up the struggle. There are 15 groups that form the fighting force of Palestine. Hamas is the largest, but there are many other groups, so we can't entirely say that the breakout was all down to Hamas. Moshe, I'm going to invite you back to develop any points that you wanted. I've just got one point. It may be that you don't have time to deal with it, and you probably won't. When you started your contribution, you said that there were basically two national rights that had to be accommodated. You then went on to develop the question of the Palestinian rights, and by implication, although you didn't say it, the other is the Hebrew or the Israeli national question. Many people in the Palestinian solidarity movement deny that there's any Israeli or Hebrew nationality. Do you have anything briefly to say about that? For what it's worth, I agree with you, but many others don't. So anyway, I'm going to ask you to come back, Moshe, to for the last 10 minutes and say whatever it is that you want to in response to the points that have been raised.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, I'm going to start with your remark because it's very important. There are very few laws in history, but one that seems to be a law of which I know no exception is that wherever you have the type of colonization that exists in Palestine, that is to say exclusionary colonization, in which the main direct producers are themselves settlers, that a new nation is formed in this. You have a new nation in Australia, you have a new nation in North America, Canada. You didn't have a new nation in Algeria. People, for ideological reasons, can deny the existence of a new Hebrew nation that formed in Palestine through Zionist colonization. It is a settler nation. But I mean, this is an objective fact. But strangely enough, this reality is denied for ideological reasons, both by some Palestinian nationalists, as well. It is not denied, for example, by the prime Palestinian historian of this generation, Rashid Khalidi. If you listen to what Rashid Khalidi is saying, he as a historian of the Palestinian reality, fully recognizing the formation of this new nation. It is also denied by the Zionist ideology, because Zionist ideology claims possession of Palestine not on behalf of a new nation that, by the way, is mentioned in the Israeli Declaration of Independence, but on behalf of the so-called Jewish nation worldwide, which is an ideological invention of Zionism, that Jews throughout the world do not form a single national group. It's a religious denomination, basically. The questions of Pam or the contributions of Pam and Janet are actually interconnected. What Pam said is partly right and partly I would say is wrong. It is not the case that the war that Israel is fighting now is a proxy war on behalf of the United States. The United States wouldn't care if Israel had left Gaza alone. In fact, the United States would prefer, for its own reasons, to have the kind of so-called two-state solution, two-state so-called solution that is still the official position of the United States. The thing is that the Zionist project and the Israeli state is fulfilling a useful role for the American presence in the Middle East. Israel, the Zionist project is exceptional in one historical respect, that unlike other cases of colonization, it was not performed. I mean, the project of colonization was not carried out by citizens of a colonial power, which sent its citizens to colonize the given territory. But obviously, the Zionist settlers were not citizens of a colonial power that sent them there, because the Zionist colonization did not have a metropole, as did the Algerian and other cases. The North American one had the British metropole. They needed not a mother country, but a surrogate mother. And they found the surrogate mother in the form of whichever great power is dominant in the Middle East. At one time it was Britain, for a short period it was France, and at the present it is the United States. That is to say, Israel does fulfill a useful role for the United States in the Middle East. And because it does fulfill this role, which it would take a long time to explicate and to go into detail, but I mean, the fact is clear. It allows the Israeli state a great amount of latitude to pursue its own interests, which are not necessarily the best American plans for the Palestinians. It needs Israel as a loyal Rottweiler in the Middle East. I think where people like David Miller go wrong is that they disseminate or they support a funny kind of inversion whereby the tail wags the dog. Certainly, you can see it in this country, you can see it in the United States. The pro-Israel lobby, the Zionist lobby, which in the United States is primarily not Jewish, it is by far numerically consisting of evangelical Christians. But certainly it fulfills a role, but you have to ask why it is allowed to have such influence. And if you look deeper into the interests of the military-industrial complex, then you will find, and I've written about this, you'll find that Israel is fulfilling an extremely useful role for the American capitalist interests, especially in the military-industrial complex. So, I mean, it is not that the tail is wagging the dog. The tail is allowed to wag because it is useful for the dog. The reason, as far as the United Kingdom is concerned, the influence of Zionism here, I think David Miller is making a double mistake. He attributes it to the Zionist lobby here in this country. In fact, the reason why the British government takes such a position towards Israel is because it is a poodle of the American hegemon. Starmer is doing what the United States is telling him to do, not because of the Zionist lobby here. The Zionist propaganda and Zionist lobby is allowed to have a big influence because this is how the British government follows as it were, the policy of its American overlords. Finally, as for the Hamas support, this is a complicated question. All available information, and some information has been available because of opinion polls have been taken. Hamas did not have a huge majority support in the Gaza Strip. It did have a degree of support, but less support than it had on the West Bank. I'm talking about the situation before this war started. And the reason is that in the West Bank, Hamas was regarded merely as part of the resistance movement that is doing what the PLO dominated Palestinian Authority in Ramallah failed to do, that is to say, to engage in resistance. In the Gaza Strip, the situation was more complicated because although the Hamas was to some extent supported as the resistance movement, it was also the government, and people blamed it for the way people normally blame an oppressive government. So the support for Hamas in the West Bank was greater than in the Gaza Strip, but it isn't the case. I mean, as far as information is available, it isn't the case that it was unpopular. It was less popular than in the West Bank. I think that addresses all the questions that have been raised. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Moshe, thank you very much for coming and addressing the meeting. A fascinating introduction and points raised in the discussion, and thank you very much for your reply. As you said, each of the questions that were raised would take an hour discussion in and of themselves, and we will no doubt have to come back to some of the points and discuss them in perhaps greater detail, and we look forward to getting you back in the new year. If you're up for that, that would be great. I'm going to close the meeting now, and I thank everybody, especially Moshe, but thanks everybody for coming. If it was your first meeting, I hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. Talking about socialism from a Marxist point of view is a group of Marxists who want to work with all others who share the idea of creating the basis of a new democratic mass communist party. And if you're interested in that, then this is the place. We've got the last Zoom meeting before Christmas is in 2 weeks' time. I think that's the 9th of December. And we'll be discussing there that issue, the question of what sort of party do we need and how do we get there? And I'd like to encourage everybody to go to the YouTube channel for Talking About Socialism. Last Saturday, we had a meeting in Manchester, which was live streamed. The discussion there has now been cut up into 7 different videos where you'll hear introductions, discussion, and responses. Have a watch of those and come to the meeting in 2 weeks' time and tell us what you think. With that, I'd like to thank everybody again. Wish you a good night. And hopefully...
One moment. Can I add one thing that I think is vital, and I must end. That is the reference to the BDS. I think in the present situation, it is imperative that we mobilize public opinion against the horror that is taking place. And one element of this is support for the BDS movement.
Thanks very much, Moshe. Good point. With that, I'm going to say thanks very much and hopefully see you all in a fortnight's time.